Good evening. Welcome to the Accountability and Justice Virtual Town Hall Series. My name is Abba Blankson. I'm the Chief Marketing and Communications Officer for the NAACP. Tonight's conversation is an important one as we discuss the verdict from last week, accountability, justice, reform, the George Floyd Act, and where we go from here. We'll hear from our congressional leaders, activists, thought leaders, and of course, take your questions and comments. For our phone participants, if at any time you have a question or a comment, please dial *3. If you're watching on social media, on YouTube or Facebook, you can leave us a comment or a question at NAACP. If you want to support the work of the NAACP, you can go to naacp.org to stay connected. With that, I'd like to introduce our moderator, award-winning journalist, our friend and partner, Mr. Ed Gordon. Ed, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Abba. Greatly appreciated. As Abba said, this is the first of a special series of town hall meetings we'll be producing in the coming months as we look at the issue of justice and accountability. I'm coming to you live tonight from the gathering spot in Atlanta, Georgia. Tonight, we're talking about after the Chauvin verdict, what's next? We gathered a number of people to discuss this, and we want, of course, to hear from you. Abba just told you, let me reiterate. If you have a question, join us. Join us tonight. Call us, 866-757-0756, and then you can press *3. That's 866-757-0756, and *3 will get you to us. The direction of where the nation goes will be dictated greatly by what happens legislatively with the proposed George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. Two of those who are on the front lines of getting that enacted join us now. Representative Karen Bass of California, who introduced the bill in the House, is with us, and Senator Cory Booker of New Jersey is also with us. He is one of those who is attempting to navigate that act through the Senate. Welcome to you both. Greatly appreciate it.
Thank you very much for having us on.
Yeah, let me start by saying that there's been a lot of optimistic talk over the last couple of days in terms of getting this act into a law, moving it to the president's desk. Representative Bass, let me start with you. How optimistic do you find yourself this evening?
Well, I'm actually very optimistic. It was helpful for the president to weigh in the way he did last night. But I will tell you that one of the main reasons why I'm so optimistic is because I get to work with Senator Booker. And working with him and his leadership in the Senate with Senator Scott, it gives me a great deal of confidence because all of us have been impacted by police issues in our lives. We know that this is a common experience that we all share. And I think when there is political will, there is a way. And I believe that we will deliver this bill on President Biden's desk.
Senator Booker, we heard from Senator Tim Scott last night. There were those who heard his message but didn't leave as optimistic as they thought. I understand. I've been getting texts and tweets and calls all day long with meetings going on the Hill. Let me ask you the same question. How optimistic are you specifically with the idea that Senator Scott will be able to find those 10 all-important votes in the Senate that is needed?
You know, what does lift every voice and say, full of the hope that the dark past has brought us. We have seen challenges and made change, and we are where we are. And I was just sitting with some of the families of murdered African Americans today. Their blood, their sacrifice, as well as that of so many activists, have helped to move us into a position where we can possibly get something done. The activism of after the murder of George Floyd, we've seen for almost a year now, with every major community in every single state, people taking the streets and demanding something getting done. That has shifted the possibility. And even in the last conference, when things didn't go well, I'll tell you, Karen Bass and others never stopped working here in Congress to try to move this forward. And so right now I'm a prisoner of hope. And the progress that has been made is promising. Nothing is for sure, but we are, I think, getting closer and closer to getting something done, something that will make meaningful change and will be real reform. And I just want to caution folks, though, and I know Karen will share this with you, we can get some really good things done at the federal level, thanks again to the continuous unyielding activism of so many. But that's not going to still be enough because we have a lot more work to do. This is an important step should we be able to get it done on a much longer journey. And right now, though, I share Karen Bass's sense of hope that we can make something happen in the coming month.
Let me ask you this, Senator, before I go to Representative Bass again. The optimism may not be as greatly shared by those in the street who find frustration almost on a daily basis. I don't want to hold you to this, but if you were to put a timetable on this, what would we be looking at when you could definitively say, yeah, we got this over the hump?
Well, again, I just want to be clear because, Karen and I are of the community. We don't just represent folks, but these are communities in which we live, in which we work. We are not going to end mass incarceration, a mass incarceration problem. This bill is not addressing the fact that the war on marijuana, remember 2019, there was more marijuana arrests in America than all violent crime arrests combined. And blacks were almost 4 times more likely to be arrested, even though their usage rates are the same. And most of those arrests, by the way, were for possession. There's a lot wrong with the system that should cause more than just frustration, that really are things that have been a burning purpose for our communities for a long time. What this bill is, so people understand, is bringing real accountability to policing, another real measures of accountability to policing. And that's everything from banning certain practices. We are looking to ban chokeholds and no-knock warrants, the things that led to the deaths of Eric Garner and George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. We're looking to raise the standard or lower the standards of accountability for police officers, address things like qualified immunity. We're looking to open up American policing because sunlight is a great disinfectant, and have reporting standards for use of force and more. There's a lot of things in this bill that will make real progress. But again, this is part of a larger picture of the work we still have to do. And so I just want folks to understand there is hope within these legislative efforts that we will make real and meaningful steps. And I'm so grateful to be working in partnership with Karen to try to move towards a conclusion soon. I don't think it's overly optimistic to think that May 25th is a reasonable date. And that's what we're working as hard as possible to get to.
That, of course, the date that the president asked for, the anniversary of George Floyd's murder. Representative Bass, perhaps the sticking point compromise is the mother's milk in Washington. There are those who are suggesting that qualified immunity can't be put on the table, particularly the progressives in your party. Where do you sit on that? And do you think that that is in danger of being a sticking point?
Well, I mean, it's one of the key issues that we're talking about, but the bill is pretty comprehensive. There's a lot in the bill. Qualified immunity and reducing the standard to prosecute an officer are 2 measures of accountability, but we're also talking about raising the standards. I mean, it's pretty shocking to think that we have 18,000 police departments in the country, and none of them have any uniform standards or accreditation. And so you go to the barber, your barber has more that he or she has to go through to practice their profession than the person who has the power to take away your freedom and your life. And if you just think about the medical profession, if you had a doctor that made mistakes all the time and people died, what would you want to do with that person? You wouldn't want that person to ever practice medicine again. And how you can be a police officer for 26 years and make a mistake between a taser and a gun that killed Dante Wright, it's examples like that we address in the bill in the terms of having a registry for officers that have done deadly things. Like if you think of Tamir Rice was killed by an officer who had been fired by a nearby department for being unstable and having a propensity to violence. We want to make sure that officers like that are in a registry and communities know about them. If you think about Derek Chauvin had 15, 16 complaints. He should have never been a police officer. Or you think about the 3 officers that were with him. In our bill, we say that those officers have a duty to intervene if you see your partner brutalizing someone. So there's a lot in the bill. There's a lot in the bill in terms of police practices, in terms of accountability. And then one feature of the bill I think is really important, and that's the part of the bill that provides grants to communities to re-envision public safety, because part of the conversation that's happening in our country is really questioning, what do communities need to be safe? I don't think communities need militaries. And so we want communities to envision what public safety is, and then to fight for those safety net resources that are going to be in the infrastructure plan, for example, that communities can begin to heal and restore programs that were decimated. And then when things fall through the cracks, we expect police to come and clean it up. So a lot we need to do. This bill is a step forward, but we have far more to do.
Before I let you both go, let me ask you to give us a sense of what you'd like from the rank and file, if you will, from voters and citizens to help you put this over the top. Representative Bass, I'll start with you. What do you need from those who want to help out?
Pressure, pressure, pressure. Please call the Senate if my colleague doesn't mind me saying that. Please pick up the phone, call Senate leadership. We need the activism, just like the senator said. It's because of the activism that we're even having this conversation. Please keep it up, always peaceful.
Senator Booker, as always, you've been very vocal in terms of making sure that your constituents understand that they are part of this game, that, you know, it can't be played without them. What would you like to see from them?
I guess I just want to thank folk and let's continue. This is not a time where Black people can ever afford to surrender to cynicism about what's going on. Remember, they blocked lynching bills for century. They blocked civil rights legislation. The longest filibuster in Senate history is right here in the Senate over civil rights legislation in the 60s. We have seen every kind of imaginable procedural roadblock, obstinance, resistance, defiance, Wallace standing there, segregation now, segregation forever. And yet we persisted, we showed resilience, we showed perseverance, and we made change. We've bent the arc of the moral universe. We are in a crisis right now, a crisis of policing that didn't start with this generation. It goes back to the Kerner report. It's why Martin Luther King talked about it on the March on Washington. Police issues go back to slave catching days. And we are trying to make it more accountable. We cannot give up. This is a moment. Let us seize it. Let us continue our activism, continue and persist. And when we pass this piece of legislation, just like the 64 Civil Rights Act, just like the 65 Voting Rights Act, just like the 68 Fair Housing Act, we did not stop. We kept the work going. So please, no cynicism, no surrender. Let's continue the pressure. Let's continue the activism until we can say, truly, we are a nation that lives up to its promise of liberty and justice for all.
Well, I thank you both, as always, not only for joining us, but keeping up the fight as it unfortunately continues, but it is the good fight, and we will stay in, as John Lewis says, good trouble until we get what we all deserve. I thank you both for joining us this evening.
Well, can we both thank Derek Johnson, or President Johnson, I should say, has been.
Yes.
Everybody should be grateful. And he is not witnessing this. He is a part of this process, and he's a partner of ours. Karen and I know we're both really grateful to have him with us.
Very much. I second
that. We second that emotion. He'll be joining us in just a few. I thank you both. Greatly appreciate it. Good to see you both.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good to see you too.
Even if the act passes the Senate, the question of reform within the rank and file is a big one. How readily will officers accept change, and how long will it take to have systematic change occur in those departments that have long been stained? That's the question. Joining us now, two women who know firsthand what it's like to be in the streets. Cheryl Dorsey is a retired sergeant of the Los Angeles Police Department. Cheryl Horne, a former Buffalo police officer, made news when she was fired after stopping a colleague from using a chokehold. Welcome, ladies. Thank you for joining us. Greatly appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Let me ask you both, and Ms. Dorsey, I'll start with you. Many people are talking about whether we are in a seminal moment, the time for change. Do you think that, particularly if this act becomes a bill, that we are in a spot to see systematic change, not individual change in a department here or there, but true systematic change? I'll start with you and then we'll move over.
I say no, because listen, police chiefs have tremendous autonomy and accountability is really the key issue here. And so we can have all the legislation, we can have all the rules and policies that we want, but if police chiefs neglect to hold their officers accountable, then we continue to have the same thing. And listen, really, they're doing quite the contrary. There are police chiefs who are passing out gift certificates for dinner at local area restaurants when you abuse Black and brown folks. Here in Los Angeles, we have on the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department armed deputies who get tattoos and have celebratory barbecues when they hurt, harm, and kill folks. And so when you have a sheriff like Alex Villanueva who's aware of this and does nothing, how then are the people in D.C. miles away going to legislate something that they can't put their hands on?
So let me just further that very quickly and ask whether or not you think that that will assist, though. I mean, there's so much optimism with this bill going through. How big of a hurdle will that knock down, do you believe?
Well, listen, so I'm speaking as a patrol officer, right? Because I did that for 20 years. And I can tell you day to day, that's not going to affect me and what I do. And as they reallocate money, as they talk about defunding the police, and as they pass all of this legislation that sounds sexy, it is not going to change what I do. Training is not necessary, but I don't say no to it. Even that is not going to change what I do day to day when I put on that uniform. And we've seen evidence of that in officers like Derek Chauvin, who've amassed 18 personnel complaints. You think he wasn't on a list? You think they didn't know who he was?
Ms. Horne, let me move to you as one who actually did what we're asking officers to do, and that's change a culture, change the idea of this silent blue line that has existed for so long. You saw what it cost you personally. Not only were you fired, luckily you have regained back pay and pension through the courts, but you lost out on the pension that was so close. How realistic is it for us to believe that officers are going to kind of see what we saw, the anomaly in this verdict, and that is stepping up and saying, yes, my fellow officer was wrong?
Well, that is the reason that I even wrote the law in the first place. But like Cheryl said, you have to change this whole system. We can change the laws all we want, but we can't change their hearts. And the first training that we get is home training. We don't know what they're learning at home, but some of them are bringing it to the job and taking it out on citizens. And so we can change the laws, but we also have to change the system. And in my case, where I went against the blue line of silence, and then you had the lawyers who backed me, and then you had the judge who also made a decision to back me. It's like we're chipping away at that system, but we have to have more than just us. We have to have it nationwide so that we can have change, because otherwise we'll be in the same boat next year and the year after and the year after. And as even with the law passed, you still have police killing people.
Yeah. We should note that you've pushed through, you and others, Carroll's Law, which requires, it was just signed in use in Buffalo, New York, which requires police to step in when colleagues use unreasonable force. Let me ask you both, it is a dangerous and sometimes unforgiving job. Not all shootings are equal. We see in Chicago and Columbus those that question whether or not that was a fair use of deadly force. Talk to me about, Ms. Dorsey, how you see the idea of making the public understand that there are times that, requires that split-second thought of, do I shoot or not?
Well, listen, there's always going to be a contingent in society who thinks police officers shouldn't use deadly force. And so I understand that. And there are times when deadly force is necessary, but it should only be used as a last resort, as we're taught. And that means that's you after you've tried everything else that you have at your disposal before you get to the deadly force. And we're not seeing that. And let me just say this real quickly. about what happened with Derek Chauvin and that blue wall of silence that everybody is all excited about, because those were police administrators, those were command staff officers, a police chief, his commander, his lieutenant, and a sergeant who testified. Those weren't patrol officers, and I think we need more of that. I think that was what was so groundbreaking, was to hear from an administrator. And I think if we hear from police chiefs going forward, call them into court and ask them, is this the kind of training you're providing? And is this what you expect of your officers in the field? We might see more success.
Ms. Horne, I asked about qualified immunity when we were talking about in the earlier segment the George Floyd Act. How important is qualified immunity, knocking it down to changing the system in your mind?
Qualified immunity is being abused. So I think that in some cases, when force is necessary, that it could be used then, but it's been abused. So if we change the whole system, and I think that a good thing that we could do is have police officers have bonds. Just like you get car insurance, once you get so many citations against you, nobody wants to bond you. And they don't need to be an officer anymore. So that's one way to do it. And I agree with defunding the police. I think that those funds should be reallocated into the community, because you should not have to go to jail in order to get the services that should be in your community anyway.
Let me give out the number for questions again. That's 1-866-757-0756. Press star 3 if you want to join us and ask a question. 866-757-0756, star 3. It would be foolish to assume, ladies, that whether or not this bill gets signed in on the anniversary of George Floyd's death, or whether or not we see laws enacted like the law, Ms. Horne, you were able to push through in Buffalo, that we're going to see the rank and file change automatically, that we're going to see some overnight difference. Let me start with you, Ms. Dorsey. In terms of optimism, give me a calendar, if you will. Can't hold you to it, obviously, but if we were to see real change, how long do we have to wait to really see systematic change across the board, do you think?
Well, I hate to be a Debbie Downer. I'm a realist, and I just, I say this all the time. Not in my lifetime. It's so systemic. It's institutionalized. It's top down. And when I say top down, I mean police chief. Listen, every chief was once an officer. Every sheriff was once a deputy. So when they get in front of a bank of cameras and clutch their pearls and act like they're surprised by something that their officers are doing, they're being intellectually dishonest. And so while we've heard from Tim Scott, who's working with Cory Booker, I believe, on this reform that qualified immunity is a non-starter. There's talk of maybe holding a police department accountable. But what do you do to deter the officer? Because unless and until the officers are held accountable, qualified immunity, we're going to continue to have this. We have a senator here in California, Bradford, who's trying to decertify officers. If they won't jump on the qualified immunity bandwagon, how about we just decertify them, take their license to be a cop away so they can't move from department to department?
Let me ask you, Ms. Horne, when we start to see where it almost becomes one of those things that is daily, we should note that there are other shootings that never make the news that we don't hear about. So when we hear about the shooting that makes the news, like Mr. Brown in North Carolina, we get sickened, but we would really be sickened if we knew and understood the sheer numbers of shootings, not always causing death, but the sheer number of police shootings that happen across the board. Do you think that people are still naive to how often this happens?
I think because of the George Floyd case that they have woke up to it happening, because we were being gaslighted before to make it seem as if it was our imagination. Another thing is officers that are there who do and say nothing. They are definitely part of the problem. And it even goes further than the police chiefs, because you have mayors who are also in on the bandwagon of doing the cover-ups. And that's part of what Cariol's law is. It's goes after an officer if they do falsify reports or anyone that's covering it up.
Ms. Dorsey, let me ask you, we hear and see too often the vilifying of the victim. We talk about the talk that we give our children. But what would you suggest? Because it seems as though there's very little one can do if you just run across the wrong officer. Whether you keep your hands on the steering wheel, whether you turn on your light inside, whether you roll down your windows or do whatever. What would you suggest in this case? And is it simply the roll of the dice depending on what cop comes to your window?
It's absolutely the roll of the dice because you don't know who you're going to get in that grab bag. But what I say to this audience is what I say to my 4 sons, and that's comply. Live to survive that police encounter. There are policies and procedures in place. You can file a report. I need you to come home safely. That's the goal, to survive that encounter and go home safely. And we understand now, since DOJ, under this new administration, is looking into pattern and practice, the importance of creating a paper trail. File that police report, document so that when it happens to someone else, you may not be the beneficiary of this officer being disciplined administratively, but certainly you may be part of the record that is going to be ultimately set. And so it's so important to comply, survive that encounter, and then complain, file a report.
Let me ask you about the DOJ. So many people get excited when it's said that the DOJ is coming in to investigate. But as we've seen in the past, there is only so much the Department of Justice can do to correct these things.
Yeah, so listen, we know that their hands are tied. There's a very high threshold when it comes to civil rights violations. And, I've been talking mightily about let's look at the human rights. Let's look at the human right violation, because before Mr. Floyd was a Black man, he was a human being. And we have rights just on the strength of who we are in our own humanity. And when you have law enforcement officials who don't honor our humanity, who don't keep us free from discrimination and free from torture, which is what they did to Mr. Floyd, had us watch it, and thus we're traumatized and tortured as well, then maybe we need to take this to a different court. Let's take it to the court that deals with violations of human rights.
Ms. Horne, let me ask you on a personal note, when you look at what you had to go through for a number of years, the loss of not only a job, but the idea that you thought your pension was gone, the toll it must have taken personally, give us a sense of the stress that you felt, or the stress that many other officers of color may be feeling just on a day-to-day basis.
The officers don't want to lose their livelihood. In my case, I don't regret it because Neil Mack still lives, where we saw in George Floyd's case, Eric Garner's case, none of the officers did anything. So they're no longer with us. So I think that we need to push for officers to be able to intervene without threat of being ostracized or losing their livelihood. That should be something in the past that I definitely will see in my lifetime. I believe that I will.
Well, ladies, I want to thank you for coming and joining us this evening and being part of those who have lived a life and have an understanding of it that lay people do not. And I greatly appreciate your forthrightness and not just on this evening, but as you've gone throughout and had that clarion call to alert us all. I greatly appreciate you joining us. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Appreciate you.
Remember, if you want to join us, we'll be taking your calls in just a few moments. 866-757-0756 is the number. Press *3 to be engaged. We'll put you in queue. 866-757-0756. Since the killing of George Floyd, the fight has intensified in many quarters, including the corners of the halls of corporate America. After the state of Georgia changed the laws making voting, many say, more restrictive, a group of top Black business executives pushed major corporations to fight the new voting laws and regulations. Among that group is Ken Chenault, the former CEO of American Express. He is now the chairman of the General Catalyst, a venture capital firm. I sat down with him earlier this week. Ken, you've said in interviews that I've seen that the killing of George Floyd moved you personally to get involved, particularly with pressuring business leaders to pursue the legislation move that we have seen in Georgia, and by extension, probably the rest of the country. where Republicans have a stronghold. What did this verdict do for you?
I think what was important to me, Ed, is that it was so graphic and so powerful, the helplessness of George Floyd. And I think similar to many African Americans, I certainly had a friend when I was growing up who had, I think, a very promising life ahead of him. Mm-hmm. And he was killed by the police. And the impact of that was something that I still feel, and it just brought back that memory, and I think demonstrated the prejudice and racism that still exists in our society.
You know, the fight that you're waging in terms of voter suppression and making sure that that inalienable right is given to all of us is interesting because it has tentacles. It's not just about voting. I mean, the idea of election really spreads throughout, all corners and aspects. When you look at corporations, the push to get them involved is how important in your mind?
So one of the things I believe in strongly, Ed, is I grew up in the civil rights era. And I was born 3 years before Brown v. Board of Education. And growing up, I wanted to be a civil rights leader. And frankly, I brought that mentality to my role in corporate America. And I believe firmly that corporations exist because society allows us to exist. And we have a responsibility to improve society, because if we want to grow as a company, we want a society that's healthy and is prospering. And so I think it's very important, but particularly on the issue of voting rights, the reality is that's the most fundamental right of Americans. That strikes at the heart of our democracy. And as you know, the path to voting for Blacks in America has been a torturous path. And a number of people lost their lives fighting for the right to vote. So I think that what was important, and I was encouraged as we asked companies to become involved, the fact that we were able to get over 300 companies, and a combination of companies and individuals, over 700 signatories on our statement that they would publicly oppose any discriminatory legislation or legislation that restricts voting.
How do we make sure that this doesn't become a blip on the radar screen, the idea of guilt from corporations or whites, and to make sure that this is systemic change versus just we need to iron over this hiccup?
I think what's very important, Ed, is we've got to look at this very comprehensively. One of the initiatives that I became very involved with and founded along with Ken Frazier was 110. And 110 is focused on working with Fortune 100 companies and Fortune 500 companies, and eventually medium-sized companies and small businesses, to in fact create 1 million jobs for Black Americans in 10 years. What I would hope is this becomes a model that we can do a multiple of that target within 10 years. I think what's also important is we've got to deal with the inequities in our educational system. We've also got to ensure that we're providing Black businesses with access to capital. We have to dramatically improve the delivery and quality of healthcare. We've got to improve our housing. So I think what's very important, is my view, is we need some form of a Marshall Plan for Black America. But it can't just be, it's just voting rights. We're not saying that. What we're saying is without voting rights, it's going to be very difficult. And the point that I make is, just imagine if Black people had had voting rights in Reconstruction. We would be a very different country.
A very different country indeed. As we just heard, voting and politics in this fight are real. Joining us now, famed attorney Ben Crump. He, of course, represents, among other families, the family of George Floyd, and most recently, he is engaged with the family of Andrew Brown Jr., who was shot and killed by police in North Carolina. Ben, good to have you with us.
So here, Ed,
Ben,
good evening.
Yeah, good evening, Ben.
Can you
Thanks so
hear me?
much. I know it's been a very busy day for you. I know you've been in meetings all day long, and I greatly appreciate it. You and I just had a conversation just a few days ago. First, let me ask you, with all of the optimism we've seen, President Biden last night called for the signing of the George Floyd Act on the anniversary, by the anniversary of his death. How optimistic are you that we're going to see at least that happen?
Well, Ed Gordon, you have breaking news because we spent the whole day on Capitol Hill at the Hart Building with the United States senators who are negotiating what will be this historic George Floyd Justice and Policing Accountability Act. And we have not given any interviews intentionally because we thought it was important that the senators give remarks about what they felt the meetings were like with these family members whose blood will be on this legislation, Ed. We met with Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer this morning. Sheila Jackson Lee was present. We then met with Senator Tim Scott and Lindsey Graham, who obviously are Republicans who have taken the leadership on this particular legislation for their party. We then met with Senator Cory Booker, who is leading the efforts from the Democratic side. We then met with Senator Dick Durbin, who is the Senate Judiciary Chair for the Senate. And then we met with Congresswoman Karen Bass, who has been the heart and soul of this legislation out of California. And everybody felt that there was momentum to pass meaningful legislation to hopefully prevent seeing some of these just horrific, unjustifiable deaths. And we had with us George Floyd's brother, Philonise Floyd, Gwen Carr, the mother of Eric Garner, Dr. Tiffany Crutcher, the sister of Terrence Crutcher, and the convener of the 100-year anniversary of the Black Wall Street Massacre out of Tulsa, Oklahoma. And we had Botham Jones' sister, who is the young man who was in his own apartment, and the policewoman allegedly came into the wrong apartment, shot and killed him, and then claimed self-defense. And when they told their stories, especially to Tim Scott and Lindsey Graham, it was very emotional. It was very engaging, and they left there very certain that those senators felt their pain.
So obviously there's optimism with all of that happening, particularly with the Republicans that you met with, Ben. But I must say, there's also a level of frustration we can't turn away from. I saw it in the press conference that you and Bakari Sellers held the other day in North Carolina. Give me a sense of how you want people to look at this, because as optimistic as they may be, we continue to see shootings and deaths around, almost daily.
Yeah, and it was troubling, Ed Gordon, because you and I and Philonise talked the day of the verdict, which I think was a historic verdict, where Derek Chauvin was convicted guilty on every count, second degree, third degree, and manslaughter for torching his brother George Floyd to death on May 25th, 2020. But then, even during the trial, 10 miles away, there was another unarmed black man, Dante Wright, who was killed by a white policewoman who allegedly was trying to pull her taser, pulled the gun, and shot and killed Dante. And then after that, you saw Micaiah Bryant in Columbus, Ohio. And then literally hours after that, the verdict came. Micaiah was killed 2 hours after the verdict. And then about 13 hours after the verdict, you had Andrew Brown in Elizabeth City, North Carolina, be killed by police sheriff's deputies running with assault rifles while his car is going away, shooting at him. That was akin to a lynch mob. And they shot him with a bullet to the back of his head, killing him. And we still have not seen the video because it has not been released to the public. And that is troubling because with all this momentum, we think we're turning the corner, but yet we see that this intellectual justification of discrimination is still real, Ed. That's why we got to pass this legislation. We got to keep mobilizing, strategizing, and organizing because that's the only way, and nobody does that better than the NAACP.
Ben, before I let you go, I want you to speak to that specifically. There is a lot of frustration that that video has not been released, and that there is concern when they put the 30-day implementation on it, that allows them to kind of shore up some things, and there's some legalities to that 30 days. So what would you like to see people do in terms of pressure and making sure that police can't hide behind some of these rules, laws, and regulations that allow them to sit on video like this?
Well, we need them to write their senator and engage their senator because this issue is specifically addressed in the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, that body cam video must be part of every uniform, every police officer's standard uniform, and that video must be made transparent within 48 hours unless there is some compelling reason beyond what they always give us, Ed Gordon, and that is that it's an ongoing criminal investigation. Well, we know those investigations can go on forever. Laquan McDonald, I mean, that video was so clear what happened, but yet they let it drag on for a year. So this is what we're battling, and this is what people can do. We can federalize this so we won't have arbitrary laws from state to state, like you're seeing, where they're literally trying to hometown us.
Well, Ben Crump, I know you've had a long day, and I appreciate you, as you always do with me, making time and joining us on this so very important town hall meeting. Thanks, Ben. Greatly appreciate it.
Hey, thank you, and thank you to Derek Johnson, NAACP, Ed.
All right, thanks. We are all concerned about policing and justice. The fight has been going on for a long time, and the energy given since the murder of George Floyd has not been matched since the height of the civil rights movement. Since the Chauvin verdict, the questions of a sea change or an inflection point are being raised. Joining us now to talk post-verdict are Derek Johnson, president of the NAACP, and Jelani Cobb, Columbia School of Journalism professor, an author and frequent contributor to many national media outlets. Gentlemen, I thank you, greatly appreciate it. I'm going to ask you all just a quick question to you first, Derek, and then we're going to get to some phone calls and then have Jelani weigh in as well. So one of the things, Derek, I'd like you to speak to is the same thing that I've been asking all of our guests tonight, and that is the optimism. Where does your needle sit when we look at getting this law enacted? And more importantly, what do you think that changes in terms of the course of the rank and file in the day-to-day?
Well, first of all, thank you, Ed, and thank you, Jelani, for joining us. Anytime you're talking about legislation, whether it's state or federal, your optimism should be after the law is passed and once you read the fine print and the detail. Legislation is the art of compromise, and we must make sure that the substance of the law meet the title of the law. And that's really important. I am glad to see that Congresswoman Karen Bass have been masterful in stewarding this process to ensure that the House passed the act without going through the rigors of another committee process in a new Congress. I am optimistic that Senator Booker is on the other side of that to receive it, to make sure the integrity of the intent behind the law is intact. But with all that in place, there is still this tension because it is the process of coming up with language that could satisfy at least 51 members to pass. And so my optimism will be once passage and I see the fine print. But I am comfortable with the process so far. I'm appreciative of the level of detail and attention that has been paid on this particular act by the administration, by the House led by Congresswoman Bass, and by Cory Booker in this moment, the senator from New Jersey. Because out of that, there is a sincere interest in an outcome to hold police officers accountable. What we must do is make sure that we can establish some trust in law enforcement agencies to keep our communities safe. And for far too long, for decades for that matter, that has not been the case. And so as we go down this path, we're working really hard to make sure we end up where we need to be so we don't have another generation who are being targeted, harmed, or killed by law enforcement officers.
Let me say to those of you who are on hold in queue on the phone calls, I'm going to ask Jelani Cobb a question, and then we're going to get right to your questions. Jelani, let me ask you, we should note that this bill, this act, if it becomes a bill, is not a panacea. What more would you like to see beyond this bill in terms of showing systematic change that we've been fighting for, quite frankly, for years and years, decades, and some will argue hundreds of years?
Well, I mean, I think what winds up in the bill ultimately is still, to be determined. One of the things that we don't know is what the fate of qualified immunity will be, and so depending on whether or not that winds up in the bill, that may be something that we want, something that we're pushing for, and that's simply saying that police don't have a kind of blanket immunity even for when they're committing wrongful acts, and they are encouraged and incentivized to behave with a kind of impunity, because they know that there won't be legal, or at least not civil, consequences for their actions. But one of the other things that we have to say is that we've talked about criminal justice, we've talked about police reform in the aftermath of George Floyd's death, but when we looked at what happened to Mr. Floyd, it was really stripping bare the facade of a whole array of other institutional relations. He was unemployed. He was a person who had been infected with COVID-19 and survived. What we're looking at is a wholesale need to reevaluate our relationships to these broader institutions. So when we want to address the criminal justice issue, I always point out we will never have a point at which we have healthcare disparities, employment disparities, housing disparities, educational disparities, but pristine policing. The policing is a symptom of a broader set of institutional relationships. And so we're going to have to tackle all of those things. So when we're talking about a living minimum wage, that is integral to us addressing these issues about police violence as the legislation that we're talking about right now before Congress.
Yeah, the import of that statement, Jelani, can't be overstated. You're absolutely right. If we only look at this as a singular issue, we're missing the point. Let me go to the phone calls. Abba, I understand we've got a number of calls, so if you can open up one of them to us, please.
Yes, we have Belinda in Slidell, Louisiana. Belinda, go ahead with your question. Okay, Belinda, go ahead with your question.
Okay, how about now?
All right, can you ask your question for us?
Yes. My concern is, has there been talk about a Citizens Oversight Committee?
Okay, Citizens Oversight Committee. So we should note that that isn't specific to the George Floyd Act, but Derek, you know that the citizen oversight in many states and cities has been one of those things that local jurisdictions have indeed implemented throughout.
You know, the problem with citizen oversight committees, they're uneven. They change from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. The level of teeth those commissions have vary wildly. What we need is a federal standard, a federal floor to hold law enforcement officials accountable to a standard of protecting and serving and not causing harm and killing. That's really important. And you cannot do that if there's no accountability. That's why the question of qualified immunity is so key. That's why 242, whether or not the standard of review of how you hold officers criminally liable becomes really, really important to make sure that there's a federal registry that's public facing so that officers who are bad actors cannot jump from agency to agency if they're dismissed. In Minnesota alone, under their arbitration state laws, even if Derek Chauvin was found innocent, although he was fired, there was a strong likelihood he would have been reemployed by the Minneapolis Police Department. 50% of all those who are terminated by the police chief or the city are reinstated because of the state's arbitration law. Citizen review boards won't change that. We need a federal standard that applies to all 50 states to protect people and protect communities.
Yeah, and that is quite important to note that we have seen officer after officer just bounce around to department after department. Okay, Abba, who do we have next?
We have Kenneth in Orlando, Florida. Kenneth, go ahead with your question.
Yes, thank you. It's more of a statement, and I want to thank all of you for what you do. However, I just feel like we have not organized the Black community into the force that it needs to be. We are doing a lot of things. We have a lot of organizations. However, we have not really organized to the point that we are, not all of us will be on the same wavelength, but to the point that we have not harnessed the resources. We have HBCUs, we have millionaires, we have billionaires, we have $1.3 trillion, and we have not harnessed those resources to transform our community. I'll hang up and listen to you.
Let me give them both an opportunity.
Can I get into that? Let me just say this. I'm a historian, and Brother Johnson here represents the NAACP. That organization came into existence in 1909, when we were still, the majority of our population had knew what it felt like to be enslaved. We have been fighting this beast with all the resources that we have available to us from the second we hit these shores. And I was just on a call. I can't divulge who I was talking to because it's a sensitive position, but I was just on a call interviewing someone about what was going on in one of the high-profile cases that involved an African-American being shot by a police officer. And this person's in a sensitive political position, said that they had to react the way that they reacted because they knew that there were going to be Black people in the streets. One of the things that's happened in the recent years is that we've seen all of these high-profile shootings of Black people by police. Now, I'm going to say something that's probably shocking. We don't talk about this a lot. In the United States, the police kill a heck of a lot of white people each year, an astounding number compared to white people in European countries, other Western countries. The only community that you see organizing to fight against a widespread societal problem that disproportionately, but not exclusively, disproportionately affects our community, the only group that you see fighting this big American plague of police violence is us.
Derek, let me let you chime in there briefly.
I want to jump in there. We have to move away from this deficit mindset of what we're not doing, what we can't do, what we haven't done, when in fact we're sitting in the evidence of what we have done and what we continue to do. This is a systemic societal problem that's supported with public policy that goes back not decades, but centuries. And so we are advancing the ball. You know, you think about 30 years ago was Rodney King. Up until that point, it was denial from elected officials, policymakers across the board that what we had been saying for decades was true. It was caught on camera. And as we continue to progress and fight in the courts to make sure African Americans were in positions of authority for agencies, Ed, you and I from Detroit, you know what it was like when we had the Big Four in stress and how Coleman Young had to come in and change the reality of how policing was done. I am a benefactor of police athletic lead. I'm a benefactor of police cadet because we had to change the relationship between law enforcement officers and communities, and those law enforcement officers were Black. So if I got in trouble, I could pick up the phone and call Benny Napoleon, who was the lieutenant over my area. I could pick up the phone and call Smitty or Officer Conway. It was a sea change compared to what exists. So we must stop talking from a deficit mindset and recognize the progress that we are making as we continue to fight, because freedom is a constant struggle.
Abba, let's try to get in a couple more if we can, as we are up against the clock now.
Yeah, we have LaTanya from Atlanta, Georgia. LaTanya, go ahead with your question or your comment.
Hello? Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Go ahead.
Okay. Actually, I like to make several quick statements. First of all, I love the police.
But some quick statements, okay?
Okay. Let me just say that I love the police. To me, there is nothing greater than someone who willingly runs towards danger, you know, when someone calls. So I just wanted to get that out the way. But also, I want to say that I feel as though police need to be, first and foremost, in the best physical condition. I believe that they need to be trained better and thoroughly trained. I also believe that there should be a national hotline. When police do something to citizens, or if citizens feel like police did something inappropriately, it should be a hotline that they could call. And people need to be tracking those calls and investigating those calls, especially if they're coming from a specific police department constantly. That's when I feel as though they need to send undercover police officers in. Also, I think that when things like that happen as well, I think those police officers need to go against a community board. I believe the community needs to get together, and the police officers should have to come before them and plead their case, because that's who they work for. They work for the citizens.
All right,
did I get it all out comments in a short period of time?
You did get it all out. We're proud of you. Thank you so much. Derek, we should note that some of that, again, as we talked about, has been tried on some a statewide basis. Oftentimes, you know, local municipalities have taken some of that. We've not seen it nationally.
Yeah, if you go to certain communities, you see a different standard of relationship between law enforcement officers and those communities. You see investment in the agency so they can set up the best service possible. They incorporate opportunities for social workers to identify and work in communities that are based in trauma. They invest in mental health support. They invest in after-school programs. They invest in community police relationships. Those are healthy standards that you can see peppered across the country. What has not happened in far too many African-American communities, that investment is lacking. They use our tax dollars and direct it towards other communities so they can have that standard. What we are pushing now is a federal standard, so that's the reality across the board. One community should not feel comfortable and safe, and the neighboring community feels less safe, and they're part of the same jurisdictions, because in that jurisdictions, everyone is paying their fair share of taxes. So we have to have a different level of relationship standard and appreciation for those who are willing to put their lives at risk and are good cops compared to the bad apples that need to be taken out of commission and in many cases put behind bars with the criminals that they are, like the criminals that they are.
Yeah. Abba, next caller.
Yes, we have Ramona in Texas. Ramona, go ahead with your question.
My question is, I think that we need a diversity training done for all officers each year I've had several jobs where we had to implement that, and it did work. And also, I would like to also say, when it comes down to going in and filing paperwork against an officer, that should be logged in somewhere, because we've had a case where we went and we filed the paperwork and no one ever said that we filed anything at all. And also, it is really crazy how correctional officers are held accountable for use of force without even loss of life, whereas a policeman with a gun can get off for a little bit of anything. And I think it just really doesn't make any sense. And
we should note, though, even
with
correctional officers, thanks for your comment. We should note, even with correctional officers, that is usually state oversight, sometimes county oversight. But Jelani, let me ask you, when she brings up diversity training, one of the things that I remind people is, in some of these instances, it's not lack of training, it's not the lack of understanding diversity. It is that you can't legislate hate and prejudice out of a person in that way. We have too many police officers. We just saw on 60 Minutes a couple of weeks ago when we saw white supremacists who intentionally went into police work to make sure that they could wear that badge and with impunity, ravage people of color. We should note that that is hard to legislate out.
It's hard to legislate out. And the other part of it about diversity training is that a lot of times these are diverse departments. When Sean Bell was killed by the NYPD, there was a black officer present. When Eric Garner was killed, there was a black officer present. When Walter Scott was killed, there was a black officer present. And so in and of itself, diversifying the police department and even training the departments in terms of handling diversity doesn't necessarily deliver the kind of change that you want. So one of the things that you have to have is a systematic rethinking of the kinds of sticks and carrots, the kind of consequences that will visit an officer or a department if they don't function correctly. The NAACP, early in its history, got behind something called the Dyer Anti-Lynching Bill, and that was 1922 or so. And that the Dyer Bill had an idea that they would impose a penalty on any county where a lynching took place and the police did not intervene to protect the life of that person who was lynched. If we had something similar, saying that for good departments, we're going to fund you in this way, but when there are wrongful incidents and when there's systemic rot, you're going to pay for this out of your budget. This comes out of your pocket. That presents a disincentive for the kinds of problems that we've seen before.
Abba, let's go to one more if we can.
Yes, we have Mario in New Jersey. Mario, go ahead with your question.
Thank you very much, and to everyone, and to my President Johnson, and to everyone that's listening. Worked in law enforcement and retired, went to fire department and public safety, 27 years retired. I'm a baby under the consent decree, and one of the major things that we were seeing is the residency requirement. It seems as though that's the loophole where it was a country club, and it's still a country club. I retired, but I'm still involved. I wanted to know if that is part of the George Floyd Act. If it's not, if you guys are going to amend that to make sure we get a federal consent for all states, because we got big problem with residency requirements.
Jelani, if you could pick up on the idea of the dissent decree, but I think it's important to note what you and Derek said earlier, and I'll let you both chime in there, is that at this point, it doesn't matter what's on that paper or not on that paper, because we are now in the midst of that negotiation. We don't know what it's going to end up if indeed it's signed.
Yeah, I have not seen anything about residency requirements in the federal legislation, and I suspect that would be something that would be handled on the state level. And that's just a fist fight with the police union, because police unions do not like that kind of legislation. And I've talked with cops and heard their side of it. I was on a ride along once with some undercover officers and one of them put on a face mask. This is pre-COVID times. Put on a face mask, and he did so because his girlfriend lived in the neighborhood that he was about to make an arrest in. And I understood why people were hesitant about that, but the net effect of it, I think, is that there's a bigger benefit to having police who are rooted in the communities that they're policing than there is to having police who are not from those communities. But that's not going to be something I'd expect to see in the federal legislation.
Yeah. Derek, you want to chime in there?
No, I agree. I don't think it will be a part of the federal legislation. You have to weigh the options. I am one to believe that majority of the officers should patrol in communities that they're familiar with, they're invested in, they care about. And it's hard to do if you're not paying taxes in those communities, you grew up in those communities, and you're not familiar with those communities. And there has to be a balance, even if it's a percentage of the officers must live in the jurisdiction in which they are
and I should note,
paycheck from the tax dollar.
I should note that as I recall, going through the act, I didn't see specific language of the dissent decree. It does mention qualified immunity limits in that specifically, and I want to close with that before I hand it over to Derek to say goodnight. And I'd like you both to address that, because from what I understand at this point, as I'm looking at and hearing from people, that may indeed be the sticking point. This question of whether qualified immunity is going to stand, particularly with progressives in the Democratic Party that say, that's a deal breaker for them if that's taken off the board. I'll start with you, Jelani, the idea of the importance of that and whether or not that should be a non-negotiable in your mind.
Yeah, I think that has to be a non-negotiable. I mean, that's really the ball game, rather. It's good to have a federal registry of problematic cops. It's good to have what looks like some sort of prohibition against the federal prohibition against chokeholds. We do know that despite the fact that Mr. Floyd died in this way and that Mr. Garner died in this way, that is not how the majority of people have died at the hands of police. And these are going to be instances that involve the use of firearms, very often, as we've seen, the wrongful use of firearms. And without something to counteract that on qualified immunity, I just don't think you get very far. This winds up being more symbolism than substance.
Derek?
Absolutely agree. One's badge should not be a shield to accountability. How you get to accountability is making sure individuals know they cannot operate above the law. And so it must be a deal breaker. Now, the form of qualified immunity, how it's rolled out, that may be in the negotiation, but there has to be accountability. And you cannot have accountability if one is immune from operating in ways in which others of us will be held accountable, and yet they can go to sleep at night knowing that they can kill someone and not be held accountable. Qualified immunity is a must, it's a non-negotiable.
Yeah. Derek, before I hand it over to you, I think that we also have to make a note and an understanding. And as I mentioned, when Ben was on, I saw the frustration with the Bakari Sellers and others, and the gentleman who was there yelling throughout the press conference, just emoting the frustration that so many of us feel, that America is going to have to understand that this pot can only boil for so long before it boils over. And so one will hope that this is the beginning of a seminal moment, an inflection point, if you will, that will move us not to, as I mentioned earlier, a panacea or a cure-all, but certainly a giant step to correcting this. Jelani, my friend, thank you for joining us, and I will give it to Derek as he will close us out this evening.
Thank you, Jelani. Thank you. And we are at an inflection point, as Ed just mentioned. This is our Selma, Alabama moment. We must decide what type of democracy we're going to live in. And in Selma, Alabama in 1964, it was a courageous act to try to force the question of our full participation, our ability to cast our vote, our currency. In a democracy, the vote is the currency. NAACP created 112 years ago in the aftermath of systemic mob fighting. Black men and women being lynched in broad daylight in the town square, oftentimes with the aid and support of those who were sworn to protect and serve. what we have witnessed over the last several years is a level of mob violence that is undermining our democracy. And so we're standing here now looking at Congress, the Senate, to be more clear, to pass something to hold people accountable so we can have the democracy that we are paying for. We're paying for it through our tax dollars. We're paying for it through our blood, sweat, and tears. We're paying for it with all of our dedication to this nation where we pledge allegiance. And now this nation owe an allegiance to the Black community, to Latinx community, to ensure that those that we fund through our tax dollars are there to protect and serve, not abuse, harm, injure, and kill unjustly. We fight to make democracy work for all, not work for all if we allow the level of police mob violence to continue to exist. Thank you all for joining us this evening, and we look forward to the next Teletown Hall meeting.